Hello, everyone. Welcome to another installment of the Hollywood versus History series by the Army Command and General Staff College and the Kansas City Public Library, made possible by a generous gift from the Jerry Rosenblum Trust. I'm Ann Knigendorf. I'm a staff writer and editor at the Kansas City Public Library, and I'm a Navy veteran, which I'll only disclose to this group for obvious reasons. No one else knows. Tonight, military historian Sean Kalic is here to separate fact from fiction in Stanley Kubrick's 1964 film, Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. Dr. Kalic has taught at the Army Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth since 2004. He specializes in the history of the Cold War. His books include Spies, the U.S. and Russian Espionage Game from the Cold War to the 21st Century, and Russian Revolution of 1917, The Essential Reference Guide. This event is live streaming on the library's YouTube channel, and toward the end, we'll take audience questions. If you're watching from home, please type your questions into the comment section. And for those in our studio audience, please step up to the microphones, which we'll have at the end of each aisle, so that our friends at home can hear what you have to ask. Welcome, Dr. Kalic.
Thank you. All right, we have about 45 minutes to talk about the Cold War in this awesome movie. So we'll talk about some context. I have three kind of main sections that we'll talk about the movie. We'll talk about the kind of the rogue commander in the front end, right? We'll talk about the B-52 crew, which everyone loves, Slim Pickens, right? Is Major Kong. And then we'll talk about the war room, which I figure is a good way of kind of breaking it up. So, and we'll talk about what's going on in the movie and then how that kind of plays out with reality. Because as the ad said, I'm here to shock you, right? Or maybe not, we'll see, okay? So let's start with some context. And the picture, let me start out with the picture up in the right, that this is not a joke, right? And this shows prominently in the movie in the beginning too, that, you know, Strategic Air Command, peace is our profession. That is the official logo of Strategic Air Command for the duration of the Cold War. That they believe they are the cutting edge of the nuclear deterrent, and that their primary job is to maintain the peace. So it fits very nicely in with kind of Kubrick's dark history or dark comedy, and the fact that peace is your profession, but you're there to bomb cities and kind of wipe things off the map. Well, no, it's all about peace first, right? And we'll talk about that escalatory ladder, which is a critical part of this Cold War process, all right? So let's start, where did the movie come from, and what are the key themes? So it comes from Peter George, who wrote this book in 1958 called Red Alert. Peter George was actually an RAF bomber pilot in the late 40s, early 50s, and flew strategic bombers for the Royal Air Force, and was a bit concerned about what happens if you have to compete or can't complete one of these nuclear missions, and wrote this fiction novel essentially about a rogue bomber going astray and starting a nuclear war. Kubrick has read the book, picks it up, and kind of turns it into a screenplay, and he's focusing on the nonfiction or the nonfiction element of it, but wants to keep it fiction, but keeps laughing as he I guess, is working the script as the history goes. And then he realizes it's probably much better as a comedy, a dark comedy, than it is maintaining kind of a nonfiction or a fiction side to it. In fact, George, or he goes by Peter Bryant when he writes the book, is given co-author credit for the movie, so we can come back and circle back to him if we need to. Premieres in January 29th, 1964, which is, I would argue, pretty significant because the United States is actually going through a substantial strategy shift as we go into 64 and 65, which I'll talk about when we get into the war room and some other places, that we're moving away from this idea of assured destruction, where if we talk about the Eisenhower administration, it was about busting cities and really bombing the Soviets back into the Stone Age. And then as Robert McNamara comes to power as Secretary of Defense under the Kennedy administration, he's starting to shift the ideas away from breaking cities and going after counterforce targets, which are really ICBM fields, bomber bases, garrison pieces, and we'll talk about how that, and what happens is it's a bit unsettling, which is really the essence of this whole movie. The movement from assured destruction to mutual assured destruction, or MAD, as it is so eloquently known, which is another piece driving this movie, that as folks learn about this transition to MAD, it is essentially MAD. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense where you can mutually kill one another and therefore nuclear weapons are supposed to wither away. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense in the tense period of the 1960s. So we'll talk about how that feeds in, because 64, I would argue, is a critical year in the Cold War as we're building a nuclear strategy, which isn't that old, believe it or not, coming from the Eisenhower administration. Dwight D. Eisenhower's president, and going back prior to 64, Eisenhower's the guy who's going to build the strategic nuclear triad that we know today, that is fixated in the movie. He's going to build, the strategic bomber force, which becomes SAC in the 40s. He's going to codify it as the main primary leg of our strategic deterrent. SAC is going to have two elements in it, essentially. They're going to have the bombers, which take about 8 hours to reach their targets. And then we're going to have ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, that take about 30 minutes to reach their targets. So SAC is really carrying 2/3 of the triad here. The other one is submarine-launched ballistic missiles, which we'll talk about those later. Those give you about 17 minutes to reach your target. So what you're doing is you're building an offensive and defensive capability for your enemies. And we'll talk how that comes into play. Now, when Eisenhower comes into office, nuclear weapons are only about 10 years old. And he's concerned because he realizes that there is presidential release authority. So the president has to physically say, yes, you can use those weapons. However, there's a caveat. And this caveat is really fixated on NATO and Europe, because the Soviet Union has about a 3-to-1 force ratio, conventional force ratio, over the United States and NATO. And the idea is that if the Soviet Union wants to start a ground war in Europe, there's no way we can necessarily stop them except if we use nuclear weapons. So this presidential release authority becomes significant in the fact that the discussion is the military needs your approval to say yes to launch a nuclear weapon, but what happens if there's an emergency situation where you can't be reached or you're incapacitated? So there is a caveat in the 50s up through the 60s of emergency release, whereby commanders in Europe can have release authority if there are imminent threats that the Soviet Union is attacking. And this is where you should gasp, right? That as individual commanders have release authority if it's an emergency situation, which again plays predominantly in the movie, but is technically true up through the mid-60s and actually on the strategic side up until the 1970s, which is pretty significant if you think about it, all right? The second part of that is John F. Kennedy. So we have Eisenhower coming into Kennedy, and this idea of permissive action links. So as Eisenhower's trying to get a handle on how do you take that emergency release away from commanders, because who would know better about emergency situations, right? Eisenhower, right? That you have to give commanders some degree of latitude if things go horribly awry. However, you don't necessarily want to start a nuclear war. So they're playing with ideas on how do you essentially withdraw that authority but yet allow a quick action and response if and when you need to. The Kennedy administration comes up with the idea of permissive action links, or PALs. Again, the Cold War is just awesome with these great acronyms, right? MAD, PALs, we can keep it going all day long, right? And permissive action links is essentially, it's designed to give you a stopgap between a emergency release and presidential authority. So it's kind of like a half step if you think about it. The permissive action link is essentially a code that you have to punch into the nuclear weapon to allow it to arm and do its thing. So if you've seen movies, well, we'll talk about it, right? You've seen movies here. It doesn't come out in this one, but if you've seen like Hunt for Red October or, Crimson Tide, where they get, they break open the plastic and there's a code in there, that's a permissive action link. The military is vehemently against permissive action links in the 50s and the 60s. In fact, the Air Force is going to drag its feet on its permissive action links up to the 70s on ICBMs. And it's been noted that when they do install permissive action links in 1970 in their ICBMs, their codes are 00000. I'm sure if they could have put password, they would have put password, right? But that's how secure our strategic weapons are. So we'll talk about how permissive action links could have fed into this, the movie as well. And then last but not least, the transition that McNamara talks about from assured destruction and mutual assured destruction, which again reinforced this idea of 1964, because we're at a transition point in how we're building our nuclear strategy. That McNamara believes that Eisenhower's support of what he calls massive retaliation is a bit dangerous and foolhardy. So assured destruction is McNamara is going to make the point that we need to move away from breaking cities and build a robust strategic force that can attack specific military targets, which sounds pretty good, right? You're allowing people to kind of breathe a little easier, and we're only going to go after military targets with nuclear weapons, but again, that's lost on most people, right? Assured destruction requires the building of a brand new series of ICBMs, better bombers, and better submarine-launched ballistic missiles. So in the process of trying to kind of move away from the tension of the Eisenhower administration, assured destruction and moving away from no cities sounds fantastic, and you're kind of moving down the escalatory ladder. The problem with assured destruction is as you build the weapons that you need to conduct it, their accuracy is about a 10-fold improvement over the previous generation. So like an ICBM in the Eisenhower administration, if you're within probably 500 yards to a mile, you're pretty good because you can compensate with a bigger warhead, right? And this is the beauty of nuclear weapons in many ways, or I guess the dark beauty, is that you don't have to be right on target. You can be somewhat close because you just build a bigger warhead and the blast will take care of anything, all right? So it's a way to compensate. Assured destruction, if you have to go after submarine fields or submarine pens or ICBM fields or bomber bases, you have to be much more precise. So as the United States embraces this idea of assured destruction, they start building weapons that are very, very capable of hitting an ICBM silo, which is in the ground. So probably about the size of this library, right? Which is pretty good from halfway around the world. The problem with that is that as you build these new weapons to kind of ease tension, the other side is becoming a little more tense because it looks like you're building first strike weapons. So when McNamara realizes that in the process of moving towards reducing tension, but by building more accurate weapons, it produces this other effect of the other side feels destabilized, and therefore they're more tense, and therefore the risk is supposed to go higher, which is where he goes to mutual assured destruction, which both sides have essentially the same type of ICBMs, bombers, and SLBMs, so no one feels inferior, and we can all kind of negotiate, and by the way, we'll go back to breaking cities too. So that way everyone's kind of even. So you can start to see the genesis of Kubrick's movie here, right? That there's a bit of lunacy involved in this nuclear theory thing, right? That you're moving up and down this ladder and you're trying to, assume what the enemy's thinking, but you're trying to secure your own national security, but at the same time, we get into this thing called a security dilemma, that as I build up to secure myself, you feel more and more insecure, so therefore you build up, which makes me feel insecure, so therefore I have to build up. So there's this back and forth that really never satisfies everyone. We can talk about more of these issues as we go into the movie, but that kind of sets the context and foundation for what's going on really in 64 when this movie was released. It really is a ironic moment in the history of it, because Truman is really just built bombs and aircraft. I would argue there's no significant, massive changes in the way we deal with weapon size. They're bigger bombs. Eisenhower is the first one who starts to build an integrated operational plan, right, which because it comes to be called the PSYOP. He develops strategic targeting up at Omaha, which is the head of SAC, which is the home of SAC. So he builds a whole structure that is the essence of Kubrick's film on the military side. Okay? All right. Let's move into the movie now. And I'll apologize in advance. I worked for about a week and a half trying to get movie clips in, and being a historian, technology and myself just don't get along. So despite lots of offers for help, I think the best thing was to go with photos, which we can talk through the film, right? So the way the film kind of starts is you have these two folks here, right? You have Jack Ripper, Brigadier General at SAC, right? Who doesn't like fluoride in the water, right? Because fluoride robs, human beings, specifically men, of their essence. And it's a plot in many ways, he sees it, right? And he's off the deep end, and he gives an order to launch his bombers, which as we talked about earlier, he does have that authority if he deems there's an imminent strike, right? And here's where I'll kind of assess Hollywood versus history, right? I'll give you my cue up at the top. Strategic Air Command logo is good, right? Like it's pretty on as far as the history goes. A nuclear weapon is kind of off, right? So this one is kind of on a little bit and off a little bit. And you'll see a pattern kind of as we go through this discussion. That Ripper starts this big long soliloquy about, the Russians are here at home, and therefore that's the threat that's driving his passion to kind of launch this war, right? And then you have the RAF liaison captain, Lionel Mandrake, who is really the sane, rational one, right? So for all the discussion here, you have, Ripper with the machine gun, chomping on the cigar. In many ways, he's supposed to be a character or a caricature of Curtis LeMay, who's known for chomping on his cigars and being a little bit unhinged, by the way. Having done some work on LeMay, LeMay isn't unhinged. He's very pointed and direct and very committed to his job of peace is their profession. However, Kubrick's going to take that and kind of twist it a bit because it makes really good comedy, right? So you have a Ripper who's a little more on the right wing side, on the deep end, right? Fluoride's bad, right? Commies are bad, right? John Birch-like, conspiracy theories. But yet this guy has control of a very powerful nuclear force, the Strategic Bomber Force. And he deems that there is an imminent threat. So what does he do? Based upon his I'll go back, right? Based upon his emergency release authority, he has the ability to do this. So he launches the bombers. And Mandrake now has to figure out how to recall the bombers, right? Anybody remember how that goes? A payphone, right. Mandrake ends up saving the day in many ways, right? Because he's able to recall the bombers except for one. One can't get through, right? And that's the problem with this whole nuclear scenario is there are steps in place to ensure that you can recall the bombers. And this is part of the strategic triad, which plays well here. So the reality is, the true side is, yes, SAC commanders had an emergency release authority in the late 50s, early 60s, mainly on tactical weapons, not strategic weapons. So there's a little bit of fudging going on there, which is why it's both, true and false in many ways. But what happens is why you have bombers, which are much easier to do than missiles, is you can't recall missiles, right? So the movie wouldn't have been very long if he was launching missiles. So the attack profiles associated with the triad are unique to ensure that the enemy has to make choices about how to defend itself. Bombers allow you a much more flexible, dynamic response. So if you launch your bombers, you have about 8 hours until they reach their targets, and you can recall them. So if you're trying to play this escalatory game, you can signal to your enemies that you are serious about doing something because the bombers have been launched and they can detect that. You can send signals that way, but then at some point, if you negotiate, you can call them back. With ICBMs and submarine-launched ballistic missiles, you don't have that ability. Once they're launched, they're gone, and there's no way to intercept them. Okay? So as far as what's going on here is, which I would argue, in many ways, this is the beginning of the story for Strangelove, right? That this is the origin of the crisis. And this is one of the fears of the Cold War, is that you have one commander who is a bit unhinged and all of a sudden has access to nuclear weapons, and then all of a sudden does something drastic one day. And then it takes one good British gentleman to stop the process. However, he doesn't stop the process, right? The process is a long, drawn-out function of one bomber can't be reached. So you have one bomber with anywhere from 2 to 8 nuclear weapons aboard, all right? Questions on the rogue military commander? All right. Let's go to everyone's favorite part of the movie, right? Which is actually probably the more accurate part, too, which is the B-52 crew. And we can come back to the commander as well, which is why there's 3 SAC logos up there. That the Air Force provided some technical assistance to this in the movie, and then when they saw the editorial cuts and the documentation, they were deeply concerned that they had given away too much. Because you wouldn't want that to get out, right? So the reality here is you have, slim pickings, right? You have James Earl Jones, which is, I didn't know this. I found this out in doing research. This is James Earl Jones' first major motion picture, which is pretty cool, right? He has that nice James Earl Jones voice, which we hear, right? He's also put there because this is a time of civil rights too. And if you remember, there are comments that Major Kong's going to make about, we're all going to get medals for this, even Lutheran Zog, who is James Earl Jones' character. So there's a nod that the civil rights and equality is coming into play. This idea of segregation is being dissipated throughout the Air Force. All right, but let's start with kind of what's going on in the airplane and how we get to kind of where we need to go. So they got the order to move out from base, right? So they flew their attack profile, and the way this goes, you have to hit it. You have a preset route, you hit a tanker, and then you're probably going up over the poles to attack the Soviet Union via northern routes because it's faster and quicker than going all the way around the globe, right? And the way it's supposed to work is you get emergency action messages from command on, at a certain initial point that's going to tell you either this is a drill or this is a real nuclear attack. And at that point, you'll get another coded message that allows you to break into the safe and pull out the actual war plans. Now, typically, SAC flew lots of attack profiles during the Cold War. Specifically in the 60s, there were always bombers in the air flying with tankers, and they would reach their IP points, which are well back from the Soviet Union, and then there would be another message saying, this is a drill, this is a drill, this is only a drill, abort, abort, abort. So this part of the movie is actually pretty right on the money if you watch kind of the sequence by which they get a message, they have to go into action, they pull out their top secret war plan R, and typically they're in a stack. And they're either numbered or they're lettered, and the coded message will give you which war plan you have to pull out. You pull the one war plan out, war plan R, you put the rest back in the safe and lock it up because you may have to do another one. Who knows, right? And then there's a discussion on what's going to happen, right? Because now you have the war plan, you're heading towards that initial point, and then you're supposed to get another radio message saying whether this is a drill or you maintain the attack profile and keep going. And when Major Kong and his crew get to the IP, they don't get a message. So as a good military commander, Slim Pickens, you have an option to make. You have a tough choice. Do you turn back and think this is a drill, or do you maintain your attack profile and proceed on to attacking the Soviet Union? Come on, it's Slim Pickens. What's he do? He's going to committed to the mission, right? Right? Attack, 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 right? And this is the way they trained. The SAC bomber training profile is essentially, if there is no message, you go on the last message you got, which is essentially war plan R. All right, we got it. We didn't get the note or the second radio communication at the initial point, so therefore we proceed on. They've already hit the tanker at the IP point, so now they are on their way to Soviet Union. It's a one-way mission, though. Because if radio communication's out, there are no more tankers, by the way. And Pickens kind of walks through this with his crew, right? The famous, survival packet, a guy could have a great weekend in Vegas with this thing, right? They're not going to Vegas. They're going to end up in Russia. One-way missions, because there's no way to get back, and they realize this. This is another kind of half-truth here. SAC did initially plan to have one-way missions. They'd recognized that the tanker force in the 50s wasn't robust enough to maintain bombers in the air as they were reaching their targets. So there was kind of a wink, wink, nudge, nudge that, do your best to get back to hit the tankers, but the reality is most of the crews knew it was a one-way mission. And that, I think, features kind of prominently in the movie. We can talk about the bomber in the movie, which is, by today's standards, horrible graphics, right? You could almost see the strings on the airplane bouncing around. But that's okay, because it was the 60s, right? And if you look at it, they actually did a very good job of making sure that the bomber was the right type of bomber, because the B-52 is going to go through a whole series of iterations. And the one they have here is one of the D models, which is the long big tail. But it's designed for nuclear weapons because there's actually a conventional bomber, a conventional B-52, and a nuclear B-52. And the way you tell the difference is the way they're painted, essentially. The conventional bombers are painted with a black cover underbelly and camouflage like you'd see in the Vietnam War. The nuclear-based ones have white on the bottom and they're silver on the top. And the white on the bottom is to help reflect the nuclear blast once they detonate a weapon. And actually the British do the same thing. So in this kind of first, second generation of bombers, nuclear blasts have, prompt radiation, heat, radiation, right, flashes. And the idea is, if you could see it kind of right here, there's that line of white, and underneath the wings and all the control surfaces are white as well to reflect as much of that heat away, because if it's black, it's going to absorb heat and do nasty things to the aircraft. So there's a lot of detail I would argue, paid to this part of the movie, which, as a Cold War historian, this is the best part of the movie, I think, right? Because you see the crew interaction and what's going on, and the reality is they're committed to their mission, which is, a one-way ticket to the Soviet Union. And we'll talk about how it ends, because, as they reach the Soviet Union and Kong opens his bomb bay doors, the bomb doesn't release. So what's any good red-blooded American going to do in this scenario, especially if you have a cowboy hat on? There's only one thing to do, right? Send it to the Ruskies. And I have that famous photo at the end, so we'll save that till the end, okay? So as far as Hollywood versus history here, I would argue that the B-52 segments are probably about as close as you can get without violating top secret issues in the 1960s. And again, as I said, the Air Force was a bit miffed that maybe they gave too much away, because they were technically consulted, and Kubrick thanks them pretty good, because it's a great part of the movie, right? A little known fact is Peter Sellers was supposed to play Major Kong, which was yet going to be another part for him. He was never comfortable being Major Kong because he didn't believe he could get the accent right. And in doing some research for today's presentation, I guess in one of the early rehearsals, he's playing Major Kong and he kind of sprains his ankle and then kind of has to pull out, but there's supposition that the next day he was walking around fine. That he hurt his ankle to get out of the contractual obligation of playing Major Kong, and then they went and got Slim Pickens with a very hard mission they have to take on, okay? All right, I think we're doing pretty okay on time, right? Now, the other part, the war room, right? And again, I focused on these three areas because I think I'll bring them back in the end and explain why. But we'll walk through the characters and then talk about the war room and then kind of fact versus reality. Much like the Rogue Commander, as you can see at the top, I think there's both, some truth here and some artistic license, for lack of a better word. All right. So we have Merkin Muffy, the president, which is again played by Peter Sellers, right? You have the Soviet ambassador. You never see the Soviet premier on the other side. You only kind of, hear Muffin talking, Dmitri, right, in a very kind of monotone voice. The U.S. president is designed to be kind of a milquetoast, not a takes charge kind of character, because the military is a take charge kind of elements. The politicians here are kind of the weak ones, right? You have, of course, Dr. Strangelove, who again is Peter Sellers, and there's lots of supposition on who is Strangelove supposed to represent. And again, I've always heard Herman Kahn from the Hudson Institute, right, who writes on thermonuclear war and on escalation. And in researching this, I guess Kahn really wasn't the actual caricature. It's an amalgamation of Herman Kahn, Henry Kissinger, and John von Neumann, who is actually a science advisor and works on the Manhattan Project. So it's kind of an amalgamation of those characters. And he's a very kind of logical, but a little half-cocked, right, on the side. He has that problem with his arm keep going up, right, because he worked for the Nazis, right, which again, the U.S. government brought a bunch of Nazi scientists into the United States to work for us in the late 40s and 50s, and he's a holdback to that. But then you have kind of, the weak politician, the strong Russian, the kind of off-the-wall kind of scientist advisor who understands these things at an ethereal level. And then you have another red-blooded American, George C. Scott as Buck Turgidson, right, who's essentially the Air Force Chief of Staff. Now, again, Scott didn't want to take this part at all. He thought it was going to ruin his career, but the reality is, I think he does a fantastic job in it, right? He's concerned about a mind gap, right, or the mind, right, the mind gap. He's concerned about, the Russians in the war room, right? That you don't let them in here. There's no way you want that. You want the secret, right? And in many ways, he's a good foil to Slim Pickens' character, but yet he still maintains that kind of robust American ethos, right? Take charge, move out, we're here to smash some Russians. The only female in the whole movie is his secretary / girlfriend. Other than that, it's an all-male role, which is, I don't think would fly in today's Hollywood, right? But in the 1964, it's okay to kind of portray the secretary as his significant other when he needs her around, right? The war room, I think, is a good part of the truth here. That the depiction of it as one round table with lights, black, and a big screen. The table and the lights are a bit overdone, but the big screen is not overdone. If you've ever seen like NASA, like Apollo 13, you have that big screen in front of with the big world map on it, right? Or maybe you've been to NORAD out in Colorado. There are big screens with big maps that will plot inbound missiles and outbound bombers and so on and so forth. So that part about how they track kind of one another and the phone lines are right on the money. Because after the Cuban Missile Crisis, that famous red phone is installed so that U.S. and Soviet premiers can get together and talk through issues as they're really happening. Because again, this is where you get those attack profiles. With a bomber, you have 8 hours to work this through. If this was done with missiles are about 30 minutes. Submarine launched ballistic missile is about 17 minutes or less. So bombers work best for a long movie format. All right. I like the war room scenes specifically because of the way that George C. Scott kind of goes off the handle on everything. Everything is quick action, right? Like, you have to do this now. You can't let them in. You can't fight. You can't do this. It's all about action. There's not a whole lot of thought behind it, right? Thoughts coming from Strangelove, but it's bizarre, weird thoughts, right? And then you have the president who's desperately trying to calm the crisis down. The movie, and yeah, we're getting to kind of that point, right? The movie's going to end with a mushroom cloud. There's an alternate ending, though, where it was going to end in a pie fight. Yeah, no, and if you get the latest version, there are outtakes, and you can see the pie fight scene, which was supposed to end it. But Kubrick believed that maybe it was just that was going too far, if you could believe that. Like, the rest of the stuff wasn't far enough, but now let's go a little further. So I think what you see in the end of the war room, I think it gets darker and darker as you get closer to kind of the impact point, right? And I think that's fitting because in 64, there is a deep concern that this escalatory ladder is going further than what most people want. And I think the comedic elements here get less and less as you get closer to the end. So as the bomber reaches its target, the inevitable is going to happen, which is essentially nuclear war, which is one of the concerns in the mid-60s, is there really a way out of it? Can we talk our way out of it? Can we negotiate our way out of it? Because the reality is I don't trust the Russians, and the Russians don't trust us. So overall, I think the movie really it's accurate in some ways. I think it's best when it's talking about the air crew in the B-52. The rogue commander has some poignant elements about the debate on permissive action links, that you need those. You need a code that is given by the commander. In fact, the president's football, right, the big briefcase that the military advisor carries, that's what's going to send that permissive action code or permission action link where they can type it in or put it into the bomb. So I think you need that. So I think it gets the important parts right on the money, but it plays for comedic effect as a way to make this a dark comedy. That this whole process of thinking about, one rogue commander can kind of lead to Armageddon is a pretty daunting idea. And the fact that life as you know it could vanish in a second with one detonation of a thermonuclear weapon is valuable, because we're going to start trying to achieve some arms control negotiations as you move into the 60s. So I think it comes at a very poignant time where we're embracing this concept of mutual assured destruction, or MAD, which goes with the movie too, by the way. and everyone's really kind of scratching their heads thinking about, do we really want to do this? But yet the paradox of the Cold War is you can't just say no because the other side will feel empowered possibly. So it's this subtle psychological game of how much is enough. And then Cold War is going to end. And we never got to this point, thank God. So I think that's a good point to end it on. We'll take some questions, have a discussion. So I'm at your disposal.
Thank you, Dr. Kalic. And again, anyone who would like to ask a question, a brief question, please come on up to these microphones and we'll take turns. And I'm also watching the YouTube channel for questions from people at home.
Sure.
I'm not sure this is appropriate relating to the movie, but today we're kind of faced with not the rogue subordinate, but the rogue commander in Mr. Putin. Do you see in the Russian chain of command somebody saying no, that we're not going to do this?
Maybe, and that goes with the movie as well, right? The famous dead man switch that they talk about, right? The dead man switch on the Soviet side doesn't come into being until the 70s, but there's a discussion that what happens if the Soviets get struck, the leadership's killed, and you can't retaliate, which gets them thinking about that automatic sequencing that you see in the movie. I don't know. I would like to think there are rational, sane people advising Putin. Now, he doesn't seem to be listening to them right now, right? And again, this is Sean Kalic's point of view, not DOD's or Department of Military History or CGSC. I think there are logical military commanders who understand this subtle game of escalation. Let's hope Mr. Putin does, because he has been doing some serious saber rattling, right?
Thank you.
Thank you. Sir?
Just two quick observations and a question. The beginning of the movie with them fueling the bombers, what a lovely sexual metaphor. And the music. The other one is, I just realized the Peter Sellers president, that's Adlai Stevenson. The bald head and everything else, the egghead?
Yeah, it's pretty close to Adlai Stevenson without being Adlai Stevenson.
Right. The final question is, though, are you going to do fail-safe next year?
I guess we'll see how this one goes first, right? But sure, absolutely. Fail-safe is a different movie, though, right? And in many ways, the Peter Bryant book, Red Alert, the studio buys rights both for Red Alert and what becomes Failsafe. And when Kubrick and Bryant read the script for Failsafe, they actually launch a plagiarism suit. Because they're like, yeah, it's too close to Red Alert and it's way too close to Strangelove. But yet it's played more straight and dynamic versus this. So, but if you look at the scenarios are pretty much spot on. It's just whether one's a dark comedy and one's kind of, about stark and logical, right? But it's the crisis of what do you do when there's a rogue bomb about to go off, right? How do you manage it? And that tension in the Cold War never goes away. We just learn to kind of deal with it in ways where you put more and more safeguards. And presidents throughout the Cold War will ask for more and more options as they have to initiate nuclear weapons, from tactical weapons all the way up to strategic weapons. So, good question. Sir?
I want to thank the previous guy. I was going to throw fail-safe out there, too, for quick discussion. But my question is, there's been a lot of studies that show that people in high positions are narcissistic and might be a little off, so to speak, like some of these folks are. What do they do in the way of mental health evaluations for somebody like Ripper, somebody like that, and maybe even the president or the Secretary of Defense, and civilian and military? What do they have mental health?
Yeah, I'm gonna phone a friend here, that John Kuhn, Dr. John Kuhn, one of my colleagues. Come to the mic.
Sir, can you please come down? Thank you.
So I served in the Navy for 23 years. So I was on an emergency action message team on the aircraft carrier. Okay. So there's a PRP program. It's a personal reliability program. This was in part initiated because of these sorts of concerns, and now it focused mostly on finding liars. And so we had to take lie detector tests. I had to take a lie detector test. And so the program really, but it also investigated your finances. They vetted everybody. So there was the mental health component of that program, not there. There was no mental health component. It was entirely focused on, could you be bribed? Could you be coerced? Could you be put into a honey trap with a KGB female spy? Were you a liar? Did you lie often? Did you lie, So that program was really focused on that. And so they really focused on your finances and your veracity.
I appreciate his comment, but I would just come back and say, crazy and crooked isn't the same thing. And so the problem with Ripper wasn't he was a crook. He certainly wasn't.
Just a little
he was
off the
just
marker.
off.
Right.
And so
No,
and
and
that's
that's a
something
fair
to be.
point. That's a fair point. That there's in one book on Strategic Air Command, there's a note in the back of the book that Bernard Brody recommends that acknowledges that there is a psychological profile of Curtis LeMay that was done in the mid-50s. I have spent 10 years trying to find it because it leads to that point, right? Because everyone thinks LeMay is this kind of crazy guy, but the reality is they were doing some early psychological profiles early on, and then they stopped the program. Because what happens if you get somebody that appears perfectly fine, but then kind of goes off the deep end, and they have the ability to launch a nuclear weapon? It is highly problematic, which is why we end up with more and more safeguards in the system.
I'll make one more and sit down. But people who go to the top of the food chain typically have certain characteristics that are sort of a little shaky, shall we say. I mean, is that something that you all look into that if you're a narcissist, you're going to try to be ambitious and move up?
I don't look at that. I look at like nuclear war plans and strategies. So
Right, it's a little out of your
which
line.
part of the reality is and you're kind of trained as a political scientist to kind of do this. You pull the human emotion out of it. It becomes really about it's a calculus. What do you want to achieve, and what are the weapons you can use to achieve it? Which is another side of this. Is that if you think about the human side, it's gonna it's a lot to kind of.
You're a historian, not a psychologist.
True, for good reason.
That's how fail-safe begins.
It is.
That discussion.
It is, right. Because it's a very logical, right? What do you want to achieve, and what are the proper weapons? And then you go from there. Right. And then you enter the human dimension of war, which changes everything, a la Strangelove, right? Sir.
Sean, let me just comment. I'll just comment on the PRP program that John just talked
Please.
about. But since I was in a PRP unit back in the late 70s, there was kind of a mental assessment, but it was, in our particular case, it was by our brigade or battalion surgeon who was a general practitioner.
Okay.
And so they're not really, they didn't do individual interviews with all of these particular people, but there was a formal, a lot of things we do in the military, we check the block.
Sure.
And so he would sign this off, but it wasn't in depth. That's certainly true. My question has to do with the fact that this film came out shortly after the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Right.
And that, to all intents and purposes, I think is the closest we've ever come to a nuclear war, at least people would say that. I don't remember how much the American public knew about what went on behind the scenes in the Cuban Missile Crisis when this movie came out, but I would be interested to know what effect, if any, the Cuban Missile Crisis had to do with the reception of this movie, and particularly how many people went to it or didn't go to it.
Yeah, no, it opens up kind of slow, and then because the Cuban Missile Crisis and word starts to spread, it starts to kind of slowly gather more and more speed and recognition. But the Cuban Missile Crisis is kind of the essence of the dark side of this, right? That most folks knew it was serious, but didn't realize how serious, and they're not necessarily privy to the back channel negotiations that were going on. So in many ways, it heightens that fear of if you have one kind of rogue commander, the world can go away. This is going to sound a bit morbid, but I'm not sure the world's going to go away in '64. Looking at the stockpiles of both sides, it's not going to be a great place to live, but it's not going to go away. The idea of mutual Armageddon in the world, nuclear winter, is a product really of the late '60s, early '70s. Carl Sagan And by that time, we have a lot more warheads than we do in 64. So 64, we're kind of hovering around, I think, 2,000 warheads, which sounds like a lot, but if you have to hit, ICBM bases and submarines and a few cities and some industry, 2,000 can be, you can go through those pretty quick, especially if you have to reserve some for a second strike. So we're starting to get more nuanced with nuclear war planning at this time. And the Cuban Missile Crisis drives that concern that we have to pay more attention to that slow psychological escalation, because it's all about signaling, right? You have to signal to your enemy, okay, I'm willing to risk A, B, and C to do this, and then you wait for a response, and you want this kind of slow escalation. The reality is the Soviets always planned to kind of do a prompt nuclear strike from the beginning. We wanted to go slow escalatory, not the case. Enemy has a vote, right? Thanks.
One of the things that that I took away from this movie also, and with movies of this era with Cold War, is just with the character Dr. Strangelove, at the essence, is that we've always focused a lot on mass resources of finances, defense, everything towards crushing communism, but yet we embraced and never really stomped out Nazism, which was, for lack of a better term, probably one of the largest evils of the 19th century. But we kind of embraced it as a drunk uncle in the room that we kind of allowed to, possibly perpetuate with all levels of government also, too.
Yeah, remember we go through denazification in Germany, and we start out pretty strict, right? That if you remember the Nazi Party, you don't get to play in the new Federal Republic or what becomes a Federal Republic. But then we recognize that there's other ideologies happening, and then there's also a subtle negotiation of, okay, what is a Nazi, right? You have Adolf Hitler, you have the party leaders, you have the black shirts, the brown shirts, but then you have von Braun, right? Who definitely has blood on his hands, but yet not quite the same taint of Nazism as others. So there's a discussion as the Cold War starts to evolve, right? That do you want those scientists to end up in Soviet hands, or do you want them to end up in U.S. hands? Can they be rehabilitated? And there is Operation Paperclip, which is actually right upstairs on the I think directly that way. I just found it as I was walking around before this. It's a great book about that race going on for who can kind of bring in the most scientists and research and development. So we don't want Nazis, but we also recognize we don't want them to go to the Soviets. So I think rehabilitation is a proper word.
Weren't they actually looking at process?
Sir, if you...
Yes, they were thinking about it, but the reality is that he brought so much research and intelligence to us.
Because I thought in that book by Abby Jacobson that they were actually later in his life, after he'd kind of served his usefulness with the space program,
Right.
that they were actually looking at prosecuting
Yeah, there were
him.
discussions because he was
But
a member of the
they decided to be a
SS.
huge-
Right.
yeah, huge
And some recent research is that he may have lied initially about his affiliation with the SS, but again, you come out of one world war against an ideology that you think has been suppressed, which it had been for the most part, and then you immediately roll into another one with communism, and the idea is you don't want those former Nazis going to the other side. So you kind of, the best you can is to acculturate them and bring them into our side. And if they want to stay in Germany, Federal Republic, not East Germany. So I think we make a strong effort to kind of subvert it. Now there are guerrilla groups in Germany up through 58, but they're pretty effectively stamped out, not only by the local governments in Germany, but also by U.S. and NATO. So there is an active effort to ensure that it doesn't come roaring back. Good question, though.
We have a question from the audience
Sure.
at home. Someone would like to know, in light of what you said about the Air Force's possible regrets about advising this movie, do you have any idea what current leadership, I guess, general military leadership thinks of Dr. Strangelove today?
I have no idea, to be honest, because I don't necessarily get to talk to the leadership. As an anecdote, I do know that since this movie, bomber crews that will be tasked with a nuclear weapon, when they go through their nuclear school, rumor has it that they get to take a picture on a nuclear bomb, riding it with a hat on. Can't confirm it, but so they may at least have acculturated the idea of, it's kind of cool to sit on a nuclear weapon and tip your cowboy hat. But as far as their personal feelings, I don't know how to answer that question.
All right. Well, here I've got another you probably
Sure.
also don't know how to answer. And this one is also from someone watching from home. Do movies influence government policy?
That's a good question. And I don't know how you prove it. But I think this one in many ways might, as failsafe does too, right? I think it reinforces the seriousness of this nuclear business. It reinforces, if we go back to the beginning slide, right, that there are concerns by the president that you have commanders who have emergency release authority, and we're going to work to reduce that, which is the PALS program. So put these permissive action links in. So I think in many ways you see the movie reinforcing it, because once you kind of make fun of it and show how ludicrous it is, right, that one guy can start this, yeah, okay, maybe we need to do it. But again, the permissive action links are pretty intriguing. In fact, if you want to read about them, Eric Schlosser writes a really great book called Command and Control, where he highlights them. That the Air Force and then even the Army and Navy don't like these things, because the idea first starts out with, well, technologically, you're adding essentially one more component to your bomb. And as everybody knows, if you add one more technical component, it's something else that can go wrong. So in a prompt situation, what if it doesn't work? That's their first line of defense. So, the scientists will reassure them, don't worry, it'll work. Okay, but it takes too long to punch the code in. So you see this kind of repetition of, deny, deny, deny. Finally, the Eisenhower administration and then Kennedy administration say, no, you're going to use these things. But they start at the tactical level. So it really becomes Germany first in NATO, and then strategic by 1970. But as I mentioned earlier, the code is 00000, which is, yeah, that was 1970. I'm sure they've changed it to, password now, right?
And it looks like we can take just one more question, so go ahead, sir.
Sure, it's General Buck Turgidson, right? And he's the Air Force Chief of Staff. I'm not sure he starts out as logical and sound. I mean, there's an edge to him, right? I mean, after all, the phone call, he's with his girlfriend, right? Now, I think he does degrade over time, but again, isn't that what you want the Air Force Chief of Staff to do, right? Support your crew who's doing the unthinkable. But again, it reinforces the dark side of this, that if you're the Air Force Chief of Staff, one of your commanders has gone off the deep end and initiated this process that you can't stop. It's, again, when you study nuclear war, it's not the most, happy, uplifting topic. It is pretty sobering, which is why you kind of try to pull the human dimension out of it. And I think you see George C. Scott getting wound up at kind of the human side of this thing, right? That you're kind of in a no-win situation. So what do, right? Support the crews, right? And get ready for the aftermath, right? Which he talks about, breeding and everything, right?
All right, that sounds like a great place to end it. That's almost
I'm not sure
a positive
that's the best place
note.
to end it, but yeah.
That's very positive.
Yeah, very positive.
Okay, well, thank
right.
you very much, Dr. Kalic.
Thank you, appreciate it.